The rain began before sunrise, washing the streets of downtown Chicago in silver light. A federal courthouse stood silent beneath heavy clouds, waiting for another ordinary day. Inside, attorney Daniel Reyes reviewed a case file that had changed his life overnight. He had expected a routine fraud hearing involving a small construction contract dispute. Instead, he found discrepancies buried deep inside financial records. Numbers did not align with official reports. Payments flowed through shell companies linked to city development funds. Daniel felt a quiet unease settle in his chest. He had served in the U.S. Navy before law school, learning discipline and patience under pressure. That training now guided him as he highlighted irregular transfers and unexplained authorizations. Something deliberate was hidden inside these documents. At 8:15 a.m., his phone rang. The caller ID showed an unfamiliar federal number. A calm voice introduced herself as Special Agent Laura Bennett from the FBI. She asked whether he had reviewed the supplemental exhibit recently added to the case. Daniel confirmed he had. Agent Bennett paused before speaking again. She explained that the exhibit had not originated from the opposing party. It had been delivered anonymously to the clerk's office late the previous evening. The courtroom doors opened before Daniel could respond further. His client, Marcus Ellison, entered with a guarded expression. Marcus was a mid-level procurement manager for the city, a man who claimed innocence from the beginning. His hands trembled slightly as he approached. Daniel motioned for him to sit. Outside the courtroom windows, thunder rolled across Lake Michigan. The weather felt heavy, as if echoing the tension building inside the building. Daniel noticed security officers positioned near the hallway. When proceedings began, the opposing counsel argued that the fraud allegations were misunderstandings caused by accounting errors. They requested immediate dismissal. The judge listened carefully, showing little emotion. Daniel waited for his moment. He rose slowly and addressed the court. He described the financial inconsistencies, the anonymous submission, and the connection to federal oversight. He requested a temporary pause in proceedings to allow independent verification by the FBI. The room grew quiet. The judge leaned back, studying Daniel with narrowed eyes. Then came a surprising response. The judge agreed to the pause, citing the seriousness of potential federal involvement. That decision shifted the atmosphere instantly. Daniel felt relief for only a moment. As he gathered his notes, Agent Bennett reappeared at the courtroom entrance. She signaled him discreetly to step outside. Her expression carried urgency rather than reassurance. In the hallway, she lowered her voice. The anonymous exhibit had been traced to an internal server within the courthouse system. Someone inside the building had accessed confidential financial records without authorization. Daniel absorbed the information carefully. That meant the case was no longer limited to contract fraud. It suggested surveillance, manipulation, and possible corruption within the judicial environment itself. Agent Bennett handed him a printed copy of the access log. One username stood out among the records. It belonged to a senior administrative official assigned directly to courtroom operations. Daniel read the name twice to confirm what he saw. The account had downloaded sensitive files at 11:47 p.m. the night before. That timestamp matched the delivery of the anonymous exhibit. He looked up at Agent Bennett, expecting clarification. Instead, she asked him a question. Had anyone approached him recently with unexpected information about the case? Daniel hesitated. He recalled a brief conversation earlier that week with a courthouse maintenance supervisor who had mentioned unusual activity near the evidence room. At the time, it seemed insignificant. Now it did not. As they walked back toward the courtroom, Daniel noticed something unsettling. The senior administrative official whose username appeared in the access log was standing near the judge's chambers, speaking quietly with court security. When the official turned and made eye contact with Daniel, a faint smile appeared. It was not hostile. It was confident. Daniel realized the investigation had not begun with the fraud case. It had begun long before he ever opened the file, and someone inside the courthouse had already been watching him. By midday, the courthouse corridors were filled with quiet speculation. Attorneys whispered near elevators, discussing the unusual pause in proceedings. Reporters gathered outside the building, sensing something significant unfolding inside. Daniel met again with Agent Bennett in a secured conference room. She confirmed that the internal access log would be preserved as evidence. However, she warned that institutional cooperation would depend on formal authorization. Daniel nodded. He understood bureaucracy well. As a former service member, he had learned that procedure could either protect integrity or delay truth. The difference depended on leadership and accountability. Back in his office, he reviewed every document line by line. The financial transfers followed a pattern tied to infrastructure grants and redevelopment contracts. Funds moved through layered entities before reaching private consulting accounts. He created a timeline on his whiteboard, connecting approvals to budget cycles. Each irregular transfer occurred shortly before major public announcements about city expansion projects. The pattern suggested influence beyond ordinary procurement errors. It implied coordination between financial decisions and public policy outcomes. Daniel felt the scale increasing with each connection. That evening, he received an unexpected visit from Marcus Ellison. Marcus appeared anxious but determined. He explained that he had been instructed to sign documents without full review. Marcus claimed that when he questioned discrepancies, he was advised to remain silent for the sake of departmental stability. Daniel recorded the statement carefully, ensuring precise wording and voluntary confirmation. Later, Agent Bennett contacted him again. Federal investigators were examining the source of the anonymous exhibit. Preliminary findings indicated the file had been transmitted through encrypted internal channels. This development confirmed intentional intervention. Someone with system-level access had attempted to expose misconduct while protecting their identity. Daniel understood the implications. If the internal official responsible for access also had authority over evidence storage, the investigation would require expanded oversight. He prepared a formal motion requesting preservation of all digital logs and restricted system records. The motion emphasized safeguarding potential evidence from alteration or deletion. As he finished drafting, a notification appeared on his secure device. An encrypted message contained a single sentence: "Stop before this escalates further." Daniel stared at the screen. The message carried no signature, yet it confirmed that someone was watching his actions in real time. He forwarded the message to Agent Bennett immediately. The investigation had shifted from financial review to active interference. Outside his office window, city lights reflected against the dark sky. Daniel recognized that the case no longer belonged to one client. It had become a test of institutional accountability. He closed his notebook and prepared for the next hearing, aware that the next decision inside that courtroom could determine whether truth would advance or retreat. The following morning arrived with heavier clouds and tighter security around the courthouse. Daniel entered the building early, noticing that access points had new verification checkpoints. The atmosphere felt different, less procedural and more defensive. Agent Bennett met him near the Federal Liaison Office. She confirmed that the internal system audit had been expanded. Additional login attempts had been detected from restricted terminals during the night. Those attempts failed, but the pattern showed persistence. Someone was testing the boundaries of oversight. Daniel understood that digital defenses often revealed intent as clearly as physical evidence. Inside the courtroom, proceedings resumed with measured restraint. The judge emphasized fairness and transparency, yet Daniel observed subtle tension in the responses from administrative staff. Conversations ended when he approached. During cross-examination, opposing counsel attempted to redirect attention back to contractual technicalities. They argued that financial irregularities could stem from routine administrative adjustments. Daniel remained calm. He presented a structured timeline connecting approval signatures, fund disbursements, and external communications. Each document referenced the same cluster of decision-makers. He avoided emotional language. Instead, he focused on verifiable patterns. Courts responded best to clarity, not accusation. His strategy depended on precision and documented sequence. By afternoon, the judge requested a private sidebar with both legal teams. In chambers, the discussion centered on evidence integrity and procedural safeguards. Daniel requested independent forensic analysis of the digital records. The judge agreed to consider the motion, but declined immediate approval. The decision maintained neutrality while allowing further review. Daniel recognized the importance of patience. Outside the chambers, Agent Bennett informed him that federal cyber specialists had begun tracing deeper system logs. Early findings suggested that the anonymous exhibit had passed through multiple internal routing layers. That complexity indicated awareness of monitoring systems. Whoever sent the evidence understood institutional security protocols and worked deliberately to avoid detection. Later that evening, Daniel returned to his office and found a sealed envelope on his desk. It contained a printed notice referencing his recent motion. The document bore no official letterhead. The message stated that continued escalation could affect professional standing and future opportunities. It was phrased as concern rather than threat, yet the implication was clear. Daniel photographed the envelope and forwarded it to Agent Bennett. She responded quickly, advising him to document every unsolicited communication. He felt the pressure rising, but refused to alter his approach. Integrity required consistency, even under scrutiny. He reminded himself that accountability often triggered resistance. That night, as Rain returned to the city, Daniel reviewed his evidence board once more. He noticed a gap in the financial timeline corresponding to a major public infrastructure announcement. The gap suggested coordination between budget allocation and media rollout. That alignment implied influence extending beyond procurement offices. Daniel wrote a note to request municipal communications archives. If political messaging aligned with financial timing, it could establish broader intent. Before leaving the office, he paused by the window. The courthouse lights reflected against wet pavement below. He realized the investigation had evolved into something larger than a single contract dispute. It had become a question of institutional transparency and civic trust. The next hearing would determine whether the evidence advanced or stalled. Daniel locked his office and walked into the night, knowing that every document he presented would either strengthen the case or reveal the limits of the system itself. The courtroom reconvened under brighter lights and quieter expectations. News of the internal audit had begun circulating, though no official statements had been released. The tension in the building felt measurable, like pressure building inside sealed glass. Daniel entered with steady posture and deliberate focus. He understood that momentum mattered in complex litigation. Each hearing shaped perception, and perception influenced outcomes even before final rulings. Agent Bennett arrived shortly before proceedings began. She informed him that federal forensic analysts had confirmed the anonymous exhibit originated from within the courthouse network. The transmission path indicated knowledge of monitoring systems. That confirmation strengthened the procedural argument. Daniel prepared to renew his motion for expanded system preservation. He intended to request immediate safeguarding of all administrative access records. When court opened, opposing counsel attempted to regain control of the narrative. They argued that continued investigation distracted from the central contractual dispute and caused unnecessary public speculation. Daniel responded calmly. He explained that integrity of evidence was not a distraction, it was foundational. Without trustworthy records, no financial review could be considered reliable. The judge listened carefully, hands folded, his expression measured. Daniel noticed subtle changes in the courtroom staff. Conversations stopped when he approached. Laptops were closed more quickly than usual. Midway through the session, the judge granted Daniel's request for preservation of digital logs. The order required immediate duplication of relevant server records under federal supervision. The ruling marked a turning point. It signaled that the court recognized potential system vulnerability. Daniel felt cautious optimism, though he remained aware that procedural approvals could still slow progress. Outside the courthouse, reporters asked questions about the anonymous evidence. Daniel declined to comment, emphasizing that the integrity of ongoing review required confidentiality. Later that afternoon, Agent Bennett shared new findings. The administrative account, linked to the earlier access log, had attempted login activity from an off-site connection the previous evening. That attempt failed due to multi-factor authentication safeguards. However, the pattern indicated continued interest in monitoring investigative developments. Daniel requested analysis of whether that account had interacted with any case-related emails. Bennett confirmed preliminary correlation between the username and document routing logs. The implications were serious. If internal staff were coordinating information flow, the investigation would require expansion to include supervisory oversight. Daniel spent the evening organizing supplemental evidence. He prepared affidavits from Marcus Ellison detailing procedural inconsistencies and signed confirmations of financial review discrepancies. He ensured each document followed evidentiary standards. Precision reduced vulnerability to procedural challenge. Emotional language was removed, replaced by structured factual statements. Before leaving his office, Daniel received another message. This one contained only a brief statement: "Your persistence will have consequences." He documented it immediately and forwarded copies to federal authorities. Repeated communications strengthened the argument for intimidation analysis. Walking home through damp streets, Daniel reflected on the shift in tone. The case had evolved from accounting irregularities to institutional security concerns. He recognized that progress would likely provoke resistance. Transparency often triggered defensive reactions inside large systems. Yet he remained committed to due process. His duty as counsel required adherence to evidence, procedure, and constitutional protections. As the city lights shimmered across the river, Daniel understood that the next hearing would test the stability of the preservation order. The investigation had entered a phase where documentation, oversight, and patience would determine whether truth advanced or stalled. The preservation order changed the rhythm of the courthouse. Digital records were now under federal duplication, and that shift altered the balance of control. Daniel felt the environment tightening around accountability. Security presence increased near administrative offices. Staff members moved with visible caution. Conversation stopped whenever federal personnel approached shared terminals. Agent Bennett informed Daniel that the forensic team had identified additional unauthorized queries tied to internal systems. The searches focused on case identifiers connected to the financial exhibits. That pattern suggested someone was tracking how evidence was being used in court. Daniel understood that monitoring investigative progress required access beyond ordinary staff responsibilities. During the next hearing, opposing counsel adjusted strategy. Rather than challenging financial discrepancies directly, they argued procedural overreach. They claimed the preservation order disrupted normal operations. Daniel responded by emphasizing transparency. He explained that safeguarding records prevented accidental deletion and protected all parties from claims of tampering. The judge acknowledged the concern and reaffirmed that preservation measures were temporary and limited strictly to relevant data. The decision maintained procedural balance. After court adjourned, Daniel met Marcus Ellison privately. Marcus appeared steadier than before, though fatigue showed in his posture. Marcus confirmed that supervisors had instructed him to expedite approvals during the infrastructure review cycle. He had questioned discrepancies but received reassurances about administrative alignment. Daniel recorded the clarification carefully. He asked whether Marcus had ever been pressured to modify documentation after submission. Marcus hesitated before answering. He admitted that one set of financial summaries had been returned for revision with instructions to streamline inconsistencies. He interpreted the phrase as routine. Agent Bennett later reviewed that statement. She confirmed that the terminology matched language found in internal communications retrieved from preserved logs. The correlation strengthened the argument for systematic coordination rather than isolated error. Daniel recognized that intent could be inferred from repetition and structure. Meanwhile, media coverage expanded. Local outlets described the case as a potential governance review. National commentators debated the implications of internal oversight within municipal systems. Daniel declined interviews, focusing entirely on evidence preparation. Public attention could complicate proceedings if not managed responsibly. That evening, he received confirmation that the anonymous exhibit sender remained unidentified. However, forensic analysis suggested the origin device had accessed multiple secured directories before transmitting the file. The sophistication of the routing indicated familiarity with courthouse architecture. Only individuals with system familiarity could navigate those internal pathways effectively. Daniel documented this conclusion in a formal memorandum submitted to the court under seal. He avoided speculation and relied strictly on technical findings. Later, as he reviewed deposition transcripts, Daniel noticed a recurring reference to infrastructure budget timing aligned with electoral cycles. That alignment appeared consistently across several fiscal years. He added a comparative chart to his file, highlighting the synchronization between funding approvals and public announcements. As midnight approached, Daniel reflected on the transformation of the case. What began as a financial discrepancy had evolved into a question of administrative integrity. The preservation order had opened doors, but it also revealed complexity. Each layer uncovered demanded careful validation before public disclosure. Daniel closed his office lights and prepared for the next day's proceedings. The investigation was advancing methodically, guided by documentation rather than speculation. He understood that steady progress often carried greater weight than dramatic revelation. In federal court, structure mattered as much as substance. The next hearing would determine whether expanded review would proceed further and whether the internal access findings would justify broader inquiry. By the sixth day of proceedings, the case had transformed the atmosphere inside the courthouse. What began as a financial dispute now carried implications of institutional oversight and federal review. Every hallway conversation felt measured and cautious. Daniel arrived early, carrying a revised motion requesting expanded forensic examination of all related administrative accounts. He had refined the language overnight to avoid speculation and focus strictly on documented access anomalies. Agent Bennett met him before court convened. She confirmed that the digital preservation process was ongoing and that backup imaging of server logs had been completed under federal supervision. That development strengthened procedural stability. No evidence could now be altered without leaving traceable indicators. Daniel felt confident that the integrity of the record was improving. When the hearing began, opposing counsel shifted focus again. They argued that the internal access findings were unrelated to the contract dispute and should remain outside the scope of litigation. Daniel responded carefully. He explained that if unauthorized system access influenced evidence submission, the reliability of all exhibits required review. He emphasized neutrality and transparency rather than accusation. The judge considered the arguments and requested clarification from the federal liaison present in the courtroom. Agent Bennett confirmed that the preservation order was precautionary and designed to maintain chain of custody integrity. After brief deliberation, the court approved limited forensic review of administrative metadata tied directly to the case identifiers. The ruling expanded oversight without disrupting active proceedings. Daniel noted the precision of the order. It allowed investigation while maintaining procedural boundaries. That balance reflected judicial caution rather than confrontation. Outside the courtroom, media attention continued to grow. However, Daniel remained committed to controlled communication. He declined interviews and referred all inquiries to official federal statements. Later that afternoon, Agent Bennett informed him that analysts had identified patterns in the administrative access logs. The username associated with the earlier download had attempted to view archived financial directories repeatedly over several months. Those repeated attempts suggested sustained interest rather than isolated curiosity. The timing aligned with key project approvals and public budget announcements. Daniel updated his timeline chart accordingly. The synchronization between access attempts and fiscal milestones strengthened the argument for systematic coordination. That evening, Marcus Ellison returned voluntarily to provide additional clarification. He described meetings where budget priorities were discussed in relation to upcoming development campaigns. Marcus explained that certain projects were framed as politically sensitive due to electoral timing. He had interpreted the instructions as strategic communication alignment. Daniel asked whether any discussions referenced external influence or private coordination. Marcus paused before stating that conversations occasionally included references to stakeholder expectations, though no names were explicitly mentioned. Daniel recorded the phrasing carefully. Even indirect terminology could contribute to understanding intent patterns. As the night deepened, Daniel reviewed every preserved document again. He focused on ensuring that each exhibit met evidentiary standards and could withstand cross-examination. He recognized that the strength of the case depended on clarity. Emotional reaction would not secure accountability. Structured proof would. Before leaving the office, he received confirmation that the forensic review would continue under joint federal oversight. The investigation was no longer limited to local review processes. Daniel felt a measured sense of progress. The case had moved from suspicion to documented procedural safeguards. Each step forward depended on precision, patience, and adherence to legal standards. As he locked his office and stepped into the cool evening air, he understood that the next phase would require even greater discipline. The investigation was stabilizing, but deeper review still lay ahead. The investigation entered a new phase once federal oversight expanded. Additional analysts joined the review, bringing expertise in financial tracing and cybersecurity auditing. The courthouse felt less isolated, more accountable under layered supervision. Daniel attended a coordination meeting with Agent Bennett and the federal forensic team. They reviewed the confirmed access logs in detail, mapping each entry against case milestones. The patterns remained consistent across multiple timelines. The analysts explained that repeated system queries suggested familiarity with internal architecture. Whoever accessed the files understood directory structures and authentication workflows. Daniel requested clarification about potential vulnerabilities. The team confirmed that no data had been altered since preservation began. All evidence remained intact and verifiable. That assurance strengthened procedural confidence. Daniel knew that credibility in federal court depended on demonstrable chain-of-custody integrity. Later that day, Marcus Ellison received formal protection status as a cooperating witness. The decision followed review of his statement and confirmation of potential internal pressure during prior administrative reviews. Marcus appeared relieved but cautious. He expressed gratitude for federal involvement and stated his willingness to continue cooperating under legal guidance. Daniel advised him to document all communications and avoid discussing the case publicly. Structured discipline would protect both testimony and investigation. Meanwhile, Agent Bennett informed Daniel that the anonymous exhibit's encryption signature matched software commonly used within municipal administrative departments. That detail narrowed potential sources. However, investigators emphasized that matching software alone did not prove authorship. Further correlation would require device-level identification or direct admission. Daniel maintained focus on admissible evidence. He prepared an updated filing summarizing verified findings, unauthorized internal access, preserved logs, and corroborated witness statements. In court, opposing counsel attempted to argue that expanded investigation delayed resolution. They requested a timeline for completion of forensic review. Daniel responded that federal processes required thoroughness to ensure accuracy. He emphasized that efficiency could never replace integrity. The judge agreed, noting that preservation measures remained temporary but necessary. The ruling reinforced oversight without prejudging outcomes. Outside the courtroom, public interest intensified. Community groups organized forums discussing transparency and institutional accountability. Daniel remained cautious about public commentary. He focused on documentation rather than advocacy, ensuring the case retained procedural strength. That evening, the federal team provided preliminary results from deeper metadata analysis. They identified coordinated login attempts from multiple terminals within a restricted administrative network. The activity occurred during non-business hours, suggesting intentional timing. Analysts confirmed the attempts were unsuccessful due to updated authentication controls. Daniel felt the scope expanding, yet he avoided speculation. He requested continued monitoring and documentation. As he reviewed the compiled evidence, he noticed something significant. The financial anomalies and system access patterns aligned with the same project approval cycles. This alignment suggested structured coordination rather than isolated misconduct. Each layer reinforced the others. Daniel closed his notebook with steady resolve. The case was progressing methodically under federal supervision. The next hearing would address admissibility of forensic findings. That decision would determine how much of the internal access evidence could enter the formal record. For now, the investigation remained stable, guided by procedure and oversight, with accountability gradually taking shape through documented facts rather than speculation. The forensic review reached a decisive stage as analysts completed their comprehensive report. The document confirmed that internal access to restricted courthouse directories had occurred repeatedly over several months. Each entry aligned with major budget decisions and public infrastructure announcements. Daniel reviewed the findings carefully with Agent Bennett and the lead federal prosecutor assigned to the matter. They emphasized that correlation did not automatically establish criminal intent, but it justified expanded inquiry. The prosecutor explained that formal subpoenas would now be issued to obtain additional communications records. This step would include archived emails, meeting calendars, and administrative routing histories. Daniel felt the weight of the process. Every document request required precise justification to survive potential procedural challenge. He focused on maintaining strict alignment between allegations and evidence. In court, opposing counsel attempted to limit the scope of review again. They argued that expanding the investigation risked transforming a contract dispute into a broader political inquiry. Daniel responded with measured clarity. He stated that the integrity of the evidence was directly relevant to the dispute, because system access logs affected authenticity of exhibits. The judge acknowledged the argument and allowed federal subpoenas to proceed under oversight. The decision reinforced transparency without assigning fault prematurely. Outside the courtroom, media coverage intensified. However, Daniel avoided public statements, ensuring that all communication flowed through official channels. Agent Bennett later informed him that one of the subpoenaed email accounts had produced limited but significant metadata. The routing trail indicated communication between administrative staff and external municipal advisors during key project periods. The content of the messages remained under review, but the timing suggested coordination beyond routine reporting structures. Daniel updated his case timeline to reflect these developments. He highlighted overlapping events, financial approvals, system access attempts, and policy announcements. The pattern demonstrated structured sequencing. That alignment strengthened the argument that oversight mechanisms required deeper examination. Meanwhile, Marcus Ellison provided additional testimony under protection status. He clarified that internal discussions frequently referenced alignment between project funding and public communication strategy. Marcus maintained that he never observed explicit illegal directives, but the repetition of timing references raised concerns in hindsight. Daniel documented every statement precisely. He avoided interpretation and preserved verbatim phrasing to maintain courtroom reliability. The federal team completed preliminary analysis of financial flows. They identified layered transfers moving through consulting intermediaries before reaching infrastructure accounts. Investigators noted that the structure mirrored patterns seen in other large municipal reviews nationwide. However, each case required independent verification. Daniel requested comparative analysis to determine whether similar routing mechanisms existed in unrelated contracts. The team agreed to expand review accordingly. As evening approached, Daniel reflected on the steady progress. No dramatic revelations had occurred, but each procedural step increased transparency. He understood that institutional reform rarely unfolded through sudden breakthroughs. It advanced through documentation, verification, and lawful oversight. The next court session would address admissibility of expanded forensic results. Daniel prepared a structured presentation focused solely on verified facts. He felt confident that the investigation now rested on solid procedural foundations. The evidence was preserved, the logs were authenticated, and federal supervision ensured integrity. The case continued to evolve, guided by evidence rather than speculation, moving steadily toward formal judicial evaluation of all documented findings. The admissibility hearing began under unusually formal conditions. The courtroom felt quieter than before, with federal representatives seated near the front row. The atmosphere reflected the seriousness of evidence integrity. Daniel presented the forensic report with structured precision. He explained how internal access logs were preserved, authenticated, and independently verified. Each step followed established federal chain of custody protocols. Opposing counsel objected, arguing that the digital findings extended beyond the original contractual dispute. They requested exclusion of metadata evidence, claiming it introduced unrelated administrative concerns. Daniel responded by focusing strictly on relevance. He explained that authenticity of submitted exhibits depended on system security. If access integrity was compromised, every document required validation. The judge asked detailed questions about verification procedures. Agent Bennett provided clarification regarding duplication methods, encryption safeguards, and timestamp preservation standards. After extended review, the judge ruled that the forensic evidence met foundational requirements for limited consideration. The decision allowed metadata to inform context without determining liability. The ruling marked another procedural advancement. Daniel sensed the case transitioning from investigation to structured evaluation. Evidence now stood within formal boundaries. Following the hearing, federal analysts delivered an unexpected update. They discovered that one administrative terminal used for unauthorized access had been recently replaced. The replacement occurred shortly after preservation orders were implemented. That timing suggested potential awareness of monitoring activity. However, investigators confirmed that the previous device had already been secured and imaged. No data loss occurred during the transition. Daniel requested documentation of the replacement authorization process. He wanted clarity on whether standard maintenance schedules justified the change. Later that afternoon, internal records revealed that the device replacement had been approved by the same senior official whose username appeared in the access logs. That connection strengthened investigative focus. Yet it did not establish wrongdoing. Authorization authority alone remained lawful unless misuse could be proven. Daniel understood the distinction. Evidence required context, intent, and demonstrable impact. He avoided drawing premature conclusions. Meanwhile, Marcus provided additional clarification during a supervised interview. He confirmed that certain project briefings emphasized alignment with broader development narratives. Marcus described pressure to maintain positive public messaging during budget cycles. He insisted he never received direct instructions to falsify records. The federal team incorporated this testimony into their analysis. They emphasized that systemic culture often influenced behavior without explicit directives. Daniel reflected on the complexity of institutional dynamics. Accountability involved structures, incentives, and oversight mechanisms working together. As evening settled over the city, he reviewed one final document. It contained a summary of system activity during the exact hour the anonymous exhibit was transmitted. The report revealed a brief administrative login from a backup terminal located outside the courthouse building. That detail introduced a new variable. External access suggested either remote authorization or broader network credentials. Daniel realized the investigation had reached a critical analytical juncture. The source of transmission might not be confined to a single office. The next phase would require tracing authentication pathways beyond internal walls, expanding the scope of oversight even further. As he prepared for the upcoming session, Daniel recognized that the truth was drawing closer, yet its final form remained carefully concealed within layers of procedural design. The expanded network review changed the direction of the investigation once again. Federal cyber specialists began tracing authentication pathways beyond the courthouse infrastructure. Their goal was to determine whether remote credentials had been used legitimately or manipulated. Daniel attended a technical briefing in a secure federal workspace. The analysts displayed a visual map of login routes showing connections between terminals, backup systems, and encrypted access points. They explained that the brief external login originated from an authorized maintenance account. However, the timing and location required further verification to confirm whether the access was routine. Daniel requested documentation of all approved remote access policies. He wanted to compare system logs with official authorization records to identify any deviations. Agent Bennett informed him that preliminary review showed no evidence of data deletion. The preservation safeguards had effectively prevented alteration. That outcome reinforced the importance of timely federal intervention. In court, the defense argued that continued expansion of the investigation created unnecessary administrative disruption. They emphasized the need for efficiency and closure. Daniel responded by reaffirming that accuracy was essential before any resolution. He explained that incomplete review could undermine future enforcement and public confidence. The judge acknowledged both perspectives and requested a progress update from the federal team. Transparency remained central to maintaining procedural fairness. Later that week, analysts discovered that the maintenance account used for the external login had been temporarily activated for system upgrades. The activation aligned with documented infrastructure improvements. However, investigators found that the same account had also accessed archived directories unrelated to maintenance tasks. That activity required clarification. Daniel carefully reviewed the timestamps. The non-maintenance queries occurred during a narrow window overlapping with the anonymous exhibit transmission. This alignment suggested either coincidence or deeper coordination. The evidence alone did not determine intent, but it narrowed investigative focus. Marcus Ellison was asked to review the timeline. During supervised discussion, he confirmed that maintenance notifications had circulated within administrative channels during the same period. He stated that he had no involvement in system-level operations and relied on technology staff for access management. Daniel documented these statements precisely, ensuring they reflected exact wording. Accuracy in testimony protected credibility. Meanwhile, federal analysts conducted interviews with additional courthouse personnel. Most confirmed routine awareness of system upgrades, though none reported irregular instructions. The investigation remained careful and balanced. No accusations were made without supporting documentation. As the week concluded, the federal team summarized their findings for preliminary judicial review. They reported confirmed internal access patterns, preserved digital integrity, and structured authorization inconsistencies requiring continued examination. The judge scheduled a comprehensive evidentiary session to review the full forensic record in detail. Daniel prepared for that session by organizing exhibits chronologically. He believed that presenting information in clear sequence would allow the court to evaluate context objectively. That night, as he reviewed the documents once more, Daniel noticed a subtle detail previously overlooked. One of the maintenance login timestamps occurred exactly 60 seconds before the anonymous exhibit was uploaded. The proximity was striking, yet still required corroboration. Daniel marked the observation for further verification. The investigation was approaching its most delicate stage, where timing, authority, and digital pathways would converge under judicial scrutiny. The evidentiary session convened under heightened security and formal procedure. Federal specialists were present alongside court officials to ensure full transparency. The courtroom felt more like a review board than a traditional hearing. Daniel presented the complete forensic timeline, emphasizing verified timestamps and preserved system images. He carefully explained the relationship between maintenance account activity and the anonymous exhibit upload. The federal analyst testified that the 60-second gap between login and transmission required additional correlation. While unusual, it did not automatically indicate misconduct. Opposing counsel argued that coincidence could explain overlapping timestamps. They insisted that system maintenance often involved multiple automated processes operating simultaneously. Daniel responded by introducing supplemental metadata showing manual navigation within restricted directories during the maintenance window. The pattern suggested deliberate interaction rather than passive system behavior. The judge requested clarification regarding user authentication layers. The federal team explained multi-factor safeguards and confirmed that all credentials were traceable to specific authorized profiles. During cross-examination, attention shifted toward the senior administrative official previously identified in access logs. The official testified under oath, stating that system oversight responsibilities required occasional elevated access during infrastructure updates. The official denied transmitting any anonymous files and maintained that all actions followed established protocol. Their demeanor remained controlled and consistent throughout questioning. Daniel focused on discrepancies between routine maintenance schedules and documented directory exploration. He highlighted entries showing repeated access to financial archives unrelated to system upgrades. The official explained that archived data sometimes required review to ensure compliance with retention policies. The explanation aligned with procedural standards but did not fully address the frequency of access. Federal investigators requested permission to conduct a deeper audit of role-based permissions. The court approved the request, limiting scope to accounts directly associated with case-related directories. This decision further expanded transparency while maintaining boundaries. Daniel recognized that oversight mechanisms were functioning as intended within the judicial structure. Later, analysts discovered that the anonymous exhibit transmission originated from a terminal located within a shared administrative workspace. The device itself had no evidence of tampering. However, the authentication session used for transmission matched credentials associated with the maintenance account during its brief activation period. That correlation strengthened investigative clarity, but still required interpretation. Access alone did not establish intent without additional contextual proof. Daniel prepared a structured summary for the judge outlining confirmed facts, preserved logs, authenticated timestamps, verified chain of custody, and expanded permission audits. He avoided conclusions and focused strictly on documented evidence. The goal was to allow the court to evaluate implications independently. As the session concluded, the judge acknowledged the seriousness of findings and ordered continued oversight until final determination. The case remained active under federal supervision. Outside the courthouse, evening light reflected off damp pavement as Daniel walked toward his office. The investigation had advanced significantly, yet questions about coordination still lingered. He sensed that the next revelation would depend not on speculation, but on one final layer of authentication review now underway within the federal cybersecurity lab. The truth was becoming clearer, but it still required one decisive connection to transform correlation into conclusion. The federal cybersecurity lab delivered its final correlation report on a quiet Thursday morning. The document summarized weeks of preservation, authentication analysis, and permission auditing. Every finding had been cross-verified through independent systems. Daniel reviewed the report in a secure conference room with Agent Bennett. The analysts confirmed that the maintenance account had been activated legitimately for infrastructure updates. However, during that activation window, credentials were used to access restricted financial directories manually. The key discovery was not the login itself. It was the deliberate navigation pattern recorded in the system logs. The movement between directories followed a purposeful sequence rather than automated behavior. The report concluded that the transmission of the anonymous exhibit originated from within the courthouse network during the same session. Yet investigators emphasized that the data indicated authorized credentials were used, not necessarily the account holder personally. That distinction carried legal significance. Credential misuse could occur through internal sharing, unauthorized duplication, or compromised access protocols. The evidence required careful judicial interpretation. In court, Daniel presented the federal summary with restraint. He explained that the investigation had confirmed integrity of preserved records and established precise timing of access events. He avoided naming responsibility and focused on verified facts. Opposing counsel challenged the interpretation, arguing that credential misuse remained hypothetical without direct proof of intentional wrongdoing. They requested dismissal of broader implications. The judge acknowledged the complexity. The court recognized that procedural safeguards had functioned properly, and that evidence preservation had prevented data loss. However, attribution required additional testimony. Agent Bennett informed the court that federal investigators would conduct interviews under formal protocols. The objective was to clarify credential management practices and determine whether any internal sharing policies had been violated. Marcus Ellison testified again, confirming that he had no knowledge of system-level access procedures beyond his assigned responsibilities. His cooperation remained consistent and documented. Meanwhile, the senior administrative official was placed on temporary administrative leave pending review. The decision was procedural, not punitive, reflecting standard practice during ongoing audits. Daniel felt the case reaching equilibrium. Evidence had been preserved, analyzed, and evaluated under federal oversight. Institutional transparency had improved significantly since the initial hearing. That evening, Daniel returned to his office and reflected on the journey from simple contract dispute to comprehensive oversight review. The process had revealed weaknesses, but also demonstrated resilience within the system. The anonymous exhibit, once mysterious, was now understood as part of a controlled transmission using authorized credentials during a narrow activation period. The motive behind its submission remained under review, but the digital pathway was clear. Daniel recognized that accountability did not always require dramatic exposure. Sometimes it emerged gradually through structured examination and cooperation. The courthouse had endured scrutiny without collapse. Preservation orders had protected integrity, and federal collaboration had ensured neutrality. As the investigation prepared for its final procedural summary, Daniel understood that resolution would depend on judicial evaluation rather than speculation. The evidence was now complete and organized. He closed his file cabinet with steady hands, aware that the next hearing would determine formal conclusions. The truth had moved from uncertainty to documented clarity. What remained was the court's final interpretation of responsibility within a system that had ultimately allowed transparency to prevail through oversight and persistence. The final court session arrived with a calm that felt different from the earlier tension. The investigation had moved through preservation, verification, and federal oversight. Now the courtroom carried a sense of closure rather than confrontation. Daniel stood as the judge entered and waited for the formal summary. The federal report had been reviewed by both parties. No evidence had been altered, and all digital records remained intact under chain of custody protection. The judge addressed the room with measured clarity. The court recognized that internal system access had occurred during a legitimate maintenance window. The evidence confirmed procedural overlap, not systemic corruption. Further review established that authorized credentials were used during the brief transmission period. However, investigators found no proof of intentional misconduct by any identified individual. The matter would remain documented within administrative oversight records. The judge concluded that institutional safeguards had functioned appropriately once concerns were raised. Preservation orders, federal coordination, and judicial review had protected integrity throughout the process. Daniel felt a quiet relief, but not celebration. The case had not delivered scandal, it had delivered accountability. That outcome required patience, restraint, and trust in procedure. Marcus Ellison approached Daniel after the session. His voice carried gratitude and exhaustion. The federal cooperation had cleared him of suspicion. He would return to his professional role under improved oversight guidelines. Daniel shook his hand firmly. He reminded Marcus that transparency was not a weakness. It was a responsibility shared by every public institution and employee. Outside the courthouse, sunlight replaced the earlier storms. The streets of Chicago reflected a steady afternoon glow. Reporters asked questions, but Daniel declined to comment beyond the official ruling. Agent Bennett joined him briefly on the steps. She confirmed that the federal audit would continue internally to refine security protocols. Lessons learned from the case would strengthen future safeguards. Daniel thanked her for professionalism and collaboration. He understood that the investigation had succeeded because agencies worked together rather than against one another. That evening, Daniel returned to his office for the final time in this matter. He reviewed his notes, timeline charts, and preserved exhibits. Every document now carried clarity and closure. The anonymous transmission had been traced. The evidence remained intact. The system had responded to scrutiny with structure and oversight. No hidden conspiracy emerged, but procedural improvements would follow. Daniel reflected on how easily suspicion can grow inside complex institutions. He also recognized how steady documentation can restore balance. Accountability does not always reveal wrongdoing. Sometimes it reveals process working as intended. He closed the case file and placed it in the archive cabinet. The investigation had strengthened trust between local administration and federal review. That outcome mattered more than headlines. As night settled over the city, Daniel walked home along the river. The courthouse lights shimmered behind him, no longer symbols of uncertainty, but reminders of transparency achieved through diligence. The story ended not with dramatic exposure, but with measured truth and institutional learning. Integrity had survived scrutiny, and evidence had guided every conclusion. Subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, and share this video.